Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode on Intentwise podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting a special guest, Rick Watson, friend, industry colleague. From my perspective, he is my LinkedIn celebrity that I follow very closely. Rick, how are you?
I'm doing great, Srinath. I'm really happy to be on and talking with you today.
Rick, I've interacted with Rick a bit, especially over the last 12 to 18 months. He comes from like a phenomenally deep background, especially on all things e-commerce. Rick, you've been in software companies, you've been in marketplace management roles, for instance, at Barnes and Noble. Can you help our audience string your background together and then just give us a sense for what you have done up to this point in your career?
Yeah, so I would say the core of what I'm about really has a foundation in technology. It's hard to understand where I came from, except to kind of learn that I went to school for electrical engineering and computer science. And so there are a lot of people that are kind of in their careers, and I always thought I would be like, oh, I'd be a software developer my whole career. And I did for several years. And then what I learned is that it wasn't enough for me.
Yeah.
I wanted to be involved in technology, but I also really loved interacting with customers and helping customers figure out how to realize their goals. And so it wasn't about the technology for its own sake. It was about technology really in pursuit of solving some market problem, what started as customer problem, and then later on market problem. So that's kind of how I think about the world is, although technology is important, I tend not to think about the technology first.
Sure.
I think about who is this for? Like even for this podcast or any talk that I'm going to do, I spend, there's this quote that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln that I was reminded of the other day. It says, like, if I had an hour to chop down a tree, I would spend 40 minutes sharpening the axe. And I'd say if I'm doing the talk, and I have an hour to prepare for it, I probably spend 45 minutes thinking about, do I understand who the audience is?
Yeah.
And what would be valuable to them? And then I spend 15 minutes preparing the talk. And so that's kind of how I think about my consulting business. That's how I think about my career. It's like, how can I be most valuable and most efficient period of time? So I spent 10 years at Channel Advisor, which essentially, when I started there, the word SaaS didn't exist. They still called it ASP.
That's true.
And so this was back in '99. So I started there as a software developer. I spent 10 years there, and we essentially invented the whole Amazon software space, more or less.
Wow.
For lack of a better word, there were 3 or 4 other companies that were helping retailers on marketplaces, and it wasn't even a marketplace back then. It was an auction. There were auction sites, Yahoo auctions and eBay and those things. So that was at the start, like seeing from '99 to 2010, if you just imagine that time period, which includes the internet boom, bust, and then the recovery through the next recession. Really was an amazing time to kind of grow with a company from the bottom, really. And when I left, I was kind of running all of product management and engineering. So kind of moving from engineering to something slightly, non-coding, to where I'm thinking more about business and customers and why do we want to build what we want to build. Worked for barnesandnoble.com to be general manager of their third-party marketplace, which I launched and helped scale. And then I spent the next 8 years of my career first at Merchantry, at a venture-backed software company, where I actually was able to I didn't start the business, but I was able to get CEO experience there, working with investors, selling that business. So just incredible experience understanding different types of customers, not just the end consumer, not just retailers and brands, but also investors. Like, what are they looking for? Like, what does success mean for an investor? And I think that kind of perspective is interesting. At Pitney Bowes, I got a lot more experience with supply chain. We're building cross-border supply chain software and services, mostly payment and kind of warehouse functionality. Pitney Bowes managed a cross-dock facility for its cross-border shippers in the US and the UK. And they acquired one of the biggest players in the space at the time, which was Borderfree, which is now resold to Global-e, which is kind of a Shopify company in a matter of speaking. And they also ran eBay's global shipping program, which they still do, at least in the UK. And then about 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, I actually exited Pitney Bowes and started the consulting firm. So this was February 2019. So I like to say that like in 2019, I saw e-commerce is still growing, but there are a lot of big brands that are left behind.
Yeah.
And I was kind of curious why. My only answer was really two things. Number one is they don't have the talent to do it. And so there are people that have been doing the same thing for more or less the same thing in sometimes great businesses, like $100 million businesses, multi-$100 million businesses that are great at retail. They're either retailers that have big store businesses, or they're brands that are selling into retail wholesale channels, and quite large businesses, but very tiny e-commerce businesses are sometimes non-existent.
Yeah.
And so my theory of why that was true, which is mostly talent and vision. They mostly just did not have the staff, a sufficient amount of staff to have experience leading initiatives to transform that part of their business. And so that's kind of what I would say half of the consulting. I have really two types of customers that I work with. One is brands primarily that are owned by private equity or recently purchased by private equity and are looking to grow big new digital commerce initiatives. Yep. So whether that is Amazon businesses, direct-to-consumer businesses, or B2B commerce businesses. And then the other half is because of my software background. I mean, if you look at my history before I started in the consulting business, 80% of my career is with software companies. Or service providers. And so I understand what it's like to be a software company CEO and selling like that whole thing. I just understand it. So I get a lot of venture-backed founders that come to me. I would say in between seed, Series A, Series B is usually the range. And they're looking to make some kind of change to their business. They need to improve their mission and vision. They need to improve their brand narrative. They need to position themselves in the market better so that their message breaks through. They're not just viewed as a Me Too competitor. And so I help them with these. In some cases, the essence of it is, who are you serving? And we were talking about this before the call. What is your brand narrative? And that really goes to storytelling. And I would say those two things by themselves are very foreign to a lot of founders and management teams. I observed that you have a lot of technical founders in our space, the space that we share, Serena. They don't have a marketing background. I don't have a marketing background, to be honest. I've learned it from the School of Hard Knocks. The idea that, oh, we're building the software for someone that's like us. It's also not true. You're building software for someone that's very different than you. And if you don't have a clear picture of who the customer is you're building for, then you get into trouble pretty quickly. You might grow very fast in the first year or two, but then it gets harder.
It's that's I'm sitting here and writing down notes because I fit that second profile, right? Founder trying to grow the business. And what's also interesting from my own personal experience is like the stage of growth at different points in time, constraints and problems you have to solve for, and the skill sets you have and your own backgrounds changes constantly. The phrase "what got us here doesn't get us there." I mean, it's true with us. I live that every day. And this is part of the reason why I enjoy our conversations, because like I'm listening, I'm writing down notes. I'm like, okay, I got to go do what Rick is telling me to do. Love that background. It sounds like, so basically digital acceleration and working with typically SaaS founders is kind of what you focus on today. What's interesting about the way you relayed your background is I heard the word ASP after a very long time. Right? SaaS was called ASP, application service providers.
Yeah.
And I think we are both revealing our age to be knowing that term.
Yes, I think so.
And also the other thing you talked about is like very few people I run into these days have seen the first, I shouldn't say first, the .com downturn. I've seen it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We're just about getting started at that time. Sounds like
Yeah.
you've gone through that too. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating experience. Tech has changed quite a bit. Software has changed quite a bit. E-commerce is growing. So clearly you're in this world of growth and new problems to be solved. I think on today's call, we certainly will get into tech and commerce and data. But before I do that, I've got a couple of personal questions to ask you. I've said it before in my at the start of this conversation. There's very few people I know that don't know you. Like you said, you're like I said, you're this internet celebrity. And by the way, for whoever is listening, if you don't already follow Rick and subscribe to his newsletter, please do. And and read diligently. You'll be way better off, like I am, because of it.
Thank you.
But I do want to ask you, even for myself, right? I put out a lot of content. I try to be educational in what I do, but you're in a different league. And I'm sure there was a point in time where you said like, hey, this is what I want to do and this is how I want to do it. Take us back to that moment, right? Personally. Wow. And how did you get started? Yeah. And how do you get here?
It's so funny. As you might expect, it doesn't just start in the past 4 years. If you kind of go back to my background, it's a very strange background in some respects, because if you look at Rick as a freshman, like myself as a freshman in college, I was the only engineer on the debate. And so that describes, like, even just that, sometimes I tell that to people, and it kind of describes sort of two sides of my personality. And I get a lot of this from my father, who has my father graduated with a business degree and a computer science degree.
Oh, okay.
And so he kind of just, that was normal to me, that you could be a technologist and run a business. And so when I was through high school and college, I was on the debate team. I enjoyed speaking and writing. And as I got through my career, I would say, let's say during the 2000s, I started a blog or two every now and then, as blogs started to become, like, blogs were a hot thing in 2003.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Blogger.com and like all these things. Yes. And from time to time, I would start a blog and write every now and then as an employee of Channel Advisor. I would stop. Like, you kind of lose the motivation. The key issue, I think, is motivation. Well, as I got to Barnes & Noble, I kind of picked it up again. And here's what I knew about Barnes & Noble. Nobody cared about Barnes & Noble at the time. Even in 2011, Amazon was already like well in the lead, and Barnes & Noble was well far behind. And so what I knew, even as a relatively senior leader at Barnes & Noble, is nobody would care what I write. And so I could write honest things that other people could not write, because they were at companies and that had PR policies. And not that Barnes & Noble necessarily didn't, but it's a big enough company that nobody cared necessarily what I was writing about.
Yeah.
And so I learned that I could write better if I didn't care who was listening, and I didn't necessarily care about being too proper in terms of, I just want to say what I feel is right and let the rest of it focus out. And yeah, there might be from time to time companies that get upset by what I say. I write about the popular companies because that's what moves the industry. That's why I write about them. I write about the companies that move the industry, like Amazon, Shopify, like these companies move the industry. And so I write about them, whatever my feeling is. And I'm like, what if I were a Shopify executive, what do I think, like, about this crazy person who's writing about me? I hope over time, if they read me, not just sort of one isolated piece, they read me over time, that I'm on both sides of it.
Yeah.
And I've changed my opinion on many different things over time. And as I learn new things, and a lot of times I'm enjoying guessing about what might happen. That's part of the enjoyment I get out of it.
Absolutely.
Is not trying. I hate the idea. Actually, I hate the idea that, oh, I'm so smart that I can predict the future. No, I can't predict it. That's dumb. To me, I think people who make too many predictions. It's not like, what's the point of making predictions?
Yeah.
What I like to do is analyze different scenarios. Like, if these things happen, this is important. So I enjoy that planning exercise.
Yeah.
And I use some of my content for that. And so kind of back to you, this is a long-winded way of getting to the kind of your original question, which is, how do I do it so consistently? And so you had mentioned before, sort of like consistency, quality, discipline, all those things matter. And I've been posting on LinkedIn basically every single day for almost 4 years now.
Wow.
Which is difficult to do. And look, the short answer is, when I started my business, I know I needed clients.
Yeah.
And I can't have clients without awareness.
Yeah.
So that is the simplest way for me to describe it. If I stop marketing, my business dies.
Yeah.
And fear of death of the business is an incredible motivation.
And I would say, like you said a couple of things here, which is, first of all, having a point of view, which can come from, thinking deeply or been in a space a long time. So that's important. Second thing you said is like not caring too much about what someone else thinks, right? And third, not being perfect before you put out an opinion. And then all that wrapped in discipline we can see what has happened here. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And there's a lot of folks, I think, in our own ecosystem that want to be visible, want to be doing things. But I think these are great takeaways to move the needle on that for themselves. So thank you again for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think today, Rick, a few topics I have in mind, a lot of it related to things you've already published, which is, e-com, just we've seen earnings reports from the Amazons, Walmarts, Targets. I pay close attention to what's happening to the advertising aspect of these businesses. And they're all different stories. But I do want to just pick your brain on understanding 2022 versus 2021, what happened, state of economy, and what does all that mean to brands, and in our case, brands and agencies in this Amazon e-com retail ecosystem. And as we get into 2023, broadly, that's kind of my theme. And also perhaps a little bit of time thinking about SaaS companies like us, what should we be planning for? Would be super helpful if that all makes sense.
No, it makes sense. Yeah, 2022 versus 2021, and now kind of going into 2023. I think it's helpful to start back in, we're just coming off of, from an e-commerce point of view, 2020 and 2021, the biggest growth years
ever.
Ever really, in the past 20 years.
Yeah.
For sure. You have to go back to like 99, 98 to have any kind of similar years. And there are not many people that have been around that long.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing that happened is we had the oh shit moment, which is March of this year, I think, where people realized that this year wasn't going to be just a little bit better than last year. It's going to be different.
Yeah.
And so I think people thought like, oh, if we could just get through these supply chain challenges, we're going to be golden.
Yeah.
The change in Fed policy, the
Ukraine,
consumers tightening, Ukraine, oil prices, rising labor costs, all these things contributed to like a lot of economic worry and a big effect on the consumer behaviors. Sure. And so I think in Q1, you didn't see it as much, but Q2, you saw big shifts in consumer behavior.
Yeah.
And that caused a lot of retail misses in Q2 and Q3 that even I think are continuing into Q4 in heavy discounting. And we're still kind of working our way through, even now, the fact that at the beginning of the year, when you bought all your, let's say, especially if you're in a seasonal business, these are the people who had it worst. You're planning all your holiday inventory buys in February, March,
right?
Confirming them in April, and then they land in August, September, depending on if it's holiday or fall or like what your seasons are.
Yeah.
If you didn't cancel those orders before they were placed, you had a rough year.
Yeah.
And so that describes so many big retailers and brands. So I think that's the story of 2022. And I think some companies avoided it. I think Macy's is kind of a standout, but many companies did not.
Yeah.
And I think folks like Walmart and Target, like Walmart did a little bit better than Target. Target was pretty rough in their earnings and write-downs, but most of the, Nordstrom's and any retailer who buys and holds inventory struggled, like seriously struggled. And so that's kind of 2022. And I think as we went from, and I think people forget the fact that in February of this year, interest rates were at 0%.
Yeah.
Zero, literally
yeah.
zero.
Yeah.
And
was that Feb? Was that Feb of this year? Is that? I mean, I didn't.
Yeah, something like that. I mean,
wow.
If not Feb, it like close around that time.
Oh wow.
Because the Fed started at zero because last year and the year before it was all about, oh, we're coming back from COVID. We need to give people a reason to spend money again. And so we're going to keep this policy. Yeah. And so now that they realize consumers were changing, they realize there's too much money in the economy and that, maybe some elements are overheated. And so now we're getting back to more quote unquote historically normal interest rates.
Yeah.
And so I think the short answer is this year and next year, and possibly even the year after that, we're still coming off the effects of COVID still.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're not in COVID, but we are playing forward all the second and third order effects of the economy shutting off, monetary policy being extremely loose, extra government money in there. And then what happens when you try to unwind that really quickly?
Yeah.
So that's to me, that's the starting point of what's happening.
Makes sense. And I think where I sit, there is the whole retail aspect of what we have seen happen certainly in Q3, and we'll see how Q4 goes. Obviously, retail media is something we sit and think about a lot. Hot topic, perhaps the fastest growing advertising segment. What was interesting about that is Amazon with this massive base, right, grew by about 30%, but so did Walmart. And then Target, I think, grew by around 10% or less, right? Yeah. So I would love your take on hype versus reality on this trend, and will the long tail of retailers ever become relevant in size compared to, let's say, Amazon? And so what's your read on that?
Yeah. Look, I think retail media in some respects has become the new co-op dollars, in retail, and like how to be seen by buyers and get information about who's viewing your brand, getting introduced to your brand in a way that you can segment and analyze and improve. So I think that is the huge breakthrough that retail media made versus traditional, especially in an era where it's very hard to get data through cookies anymore.
True.
You can't just sort of steal data from the browser anymore, which is what marketers have been doing forever.
A long time.
And so it's become harder to do that.
Yeah.
And so in the face of that, retail media has been this sort of big savior, and that's kind of number one. And second, I think all digital media has continued to rise because we're still dealing with multi-decade secular shifts from offline to online advertising.
Yes.
And so retail media naturally benefits from that still. It just happens to be the fastest growing component, digital advertising, because, Facebook and Google have already had their
and Google continues to grow. Google continues to grow. I mean, Facebook has had a very specific issue that they've run into, but Google continues to grow.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. The company, the first e-commerce company I worked at was a company founded by Scott Wingo, who founded Channel Advisor. It was called Auction Rover. Auction Rover was bought by GoTo.com, which invented paid search, which is Google's biggest business model. In fact, it's like the best business model in the history of business models. essentially. And it's very hard to argue otherwise because they're insanely profitable.
Yep.
Except if you consider like, okay, if we had a desktop and an office software monopoly like Microsoft, and that's a pretty good business model too.
Yes.
And so the fact that we're having to talk about those two companies, but all this to mean that Google and Facebook have already had their run.
Yeah.
And they're going to keep. I think Facebook, most of its wounds are self-inflicted, or well, we could talk about Facebook on its own, but from a Google point of view, people aren't going to stop typing in Google anytime soon.
Yeah, true.
And right.
And the one thing that surprised me so far about Google, and perhaps it's something I miss about this, is Google, I thought, would just go and power all the media platforms for all these retailers. I don't know if it's too small for them or why Google hasn't shown up and become the behind the scenes ad tech stack for a lot of the retailers is a puzzle for me.
Yeah, here's what I've observed by advertising companies that have attempted to move into retail or even software businesses. The reason is advertising is such a high margin business that it's very hard to convince the investors and the management to move into lower margin businesses. And I think Amazon had the interesting position that, what did Jeff do? He was reselling books that he was buying from Baker and Taylor and Ingram Micro.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of Amazon. He didn't produce books.
Yeah.
He didn't manufacture books. He was a reseller.
Yep.
And so when he entered the toy business, they had employees going to Toys R Us stores
to buy.
I mean, the business model was not special.
Yeah.
The technology and the inventiveness was special.
Yeah.
And the people there were special, I would argue as well. But what I think is when you come from that kind of business where you're struggling to break even, any retail business, period, they're struggling to break even.
Yep.
Like, if you have 5 points of margin at the end of the day, that's a great solid retail business. That's Walmart, right?
And you would run at these opportunities. I get your point where like someone sitting in Google's position may not look at it.
It looks like a terrible business.
Totally makes sense. I think
so that's why Google has never disrupted Amazon, period. Like I remember being at Channel Advisor talking to Google in 2006.
Yeah.
About like, oh, we see what Amazon's doing. We're going to make our own marketplace. And we had that conversation every 2 years.
Yeah.
With them, with a new person, new and different person.
Yeah.
So I think Google doesn't really understand retail to a serious degree.
Sure.
They have a lot of bright retail people in different ways.
Yeah.
But mostly about ads.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, totally. That's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about that. Meaning like when your bread and butter business is such high margin, you're not going to go do other things a whole lot.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're forced to.
Talking about Amazon, I think very recently you had written about, how Amazon you expect to continue to make big bets through the downturn if there were a continued downturn. Talk about that a little bit. And I know you've always held the thesis of how important product innovation is for long-term sustenance. But they are making some moves, right? Like they've let go a bunch of people around Alexa, and they're making certain moves. But even within all of that, you expect them to go invest and keep making certain big bets. So talk through that a little bit for me.
Yeah. So I would say, look, right now, Amazon has really two businesses. One is Prime.
Yeah.
And then the other is AWS, really. Prime covers everything, really everything, including logistics. I would say even with Amazon's innovation and the things that they've shut down and the mistakes that they've made, making on big bets, they're still making pretty big bets. The ads business, as you will know, it's a relatively new business at Amazon.
Yeah.
You know,
Sure.
6 years ago, what was the ad business?
Yeah.
Not hardly anything, you know.
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos famously didn't want ads on the platform for years and years, thinking it would be because they were so customer obsessed, and Bill and Jeff didn't care about the margin.
Yeah.
Really. Now I think that changed clearly in a big way. Now everything is for sale on Amazon. Every square pixel, it feels like, is for sale, as you know, because that's your business. I think ads is a big business. I think they want to make logistics a big business outside of Amazon as well. So I think that's a bet they're making. They've launched AWD, and I think they're going to try to expand MCF. And I think that's part of what they're doing with Buy with Prime, trying to move off Amazon. And then I think part of ads is video as well. And so it's hard to forget about the fact that they just bought a movie studio, an entire movie studio, you know. And what is that? As far as I'm concerned, it's an ad surface. All of their content efforts are ad surfaces. That's it. It's a way to learn about consumer behavior, and it's a way to give advertisers a way to reach that behavior in a measurable way.
Yeah.
And I think that last part is key, because that's always the key to anything Amazon is doing. Is we're going to be more measurable and more transparent than any other ad marketplace. So I think that's one thing. And then the other big bet that they're making is healthcare, which who knows what the heck they're going to do there. But I can tell you the process of going from a general practitioner who refers me to a specialist, and I have to wait to reach them every few weeks and months, and then go to the pharmacy and wait in a 12-hour line to get my prescription. I hope Amazon takes over the whole space, to be honest with you, because it's a disaster.
It's crazy. And I think, yeah, I mean, and I have a bunch of friends and family that work there, and what they've done for their employees in terms of, you know, how quickly they can set up appointments, get some basic health checks done. It's incredible. I mean, to be honest, if they are able to get that and turn that into a service for the entire country, that'll be pretty tremendous.
Yeah. And so I think if you look at the retail business that's not having to do with ads or logistics, I think Amazon is pretty boring. I mean, yeah, they're making PDP improvements, they're improving the search, they're adding little new ad units, and, you know, surfacing images better. And what else are they doing? Like more lightning deal? Like, it's not that interesting. Right?
Yeah. So Buy with Prime, right? Obviously, it's been on the airwaves quite a bit, like a few months back. I know you have a point of view on this. Now, I mean, maybe they're working on it, but it's not widespread. Like, you don't necessarily run into it everywhere. Maybe it's them working through the kinks. But super interested in your take on where you see that going, hype versus reality around that. And then, of course, what does it mean for Shopify and big commerce? Because I know Shopify did a little bit of dance around, yes, we will allow, then no, we won't allow, and I don't know where it is at. I don't follow that very closely, but would love your take on that.
Yeah, look, I think Buy with Prime, to me, there are a couple of things that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years inside of Amazon. Number one is they used to run a web store business, and they gave it away. They actually tried to give it to big commerce. Big commerce didn't want it, and they gave it to Shopify. And so essentially, like, you know, I don't know, I used to know what the number was, but it's anywhere between a couple of hundred stores and a couple of thousand stores were essentially given away by Amazon to another provider. And so I think there are people inside Amazon that have a little bit of Shopify FOMO, if you want my honest opinion, that they've tried to do stores in the past. It didn't work. Shopify came from nowhere. And who knows e-commerce better than Amazon? Who are these crazy Canadian guys? Right? And so I think there's some of that. Like, to me, that's kind of the baseline, right? And then on top of that, you build the fact that in the past 3-4 years, off Amazon e-commerce has started to grow slightly faster than on Amazon e-commerce. Meaning, like particularly like the SMB middle market brands, and part of that is part of that is, I would say, sustainable, and part of that is unsustainable.
Yeah.
The sustainable part is that Amazon has started to ask some interesting questions, because there are certain products that people just don't want to buy on Amazon, that are hard to buy on Amazon.
Yeah.
Whether because of trust or they're just not known for that category, or whatever it is. I think the other part is, obviously VC investment in direct-to-consumer brands have artificially pushed that growth faster, and obviously now that is slowing down.
Yeah.
So some of that will come back to earth.
Yeah.
A little bit. And so I think the interesting thing from a career point of view is that historically you had Amazon, or you had marketplace focused brands, and then you had direct focused brands.
Yeah.
And the two worlds did not meet very often, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
The marketplace focused brands really didn't mostly care about their own website. And I think that's by and large still true, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It's the direct-to-consumer brands that have, some of them started to care a decent amount about Amazon. I think those are the more crossover audience, because I think most of the historically focused marketplace brands, they think of Amazon as, oh, they're going to give me the traffic. I just want to focus on the product and the operations, right?
That's right.
That's just the historical promise that has been made, whether you call it a devil's promise or not. That's the bargain that was struck between the brand owners and or the sellers and Amazon. And so I think the idea, look, Amazon is trying to find margin wherever it is, and if it can go into a higher growth market, which is these off Amazon sellers, it's going to try and do that. And by the way, who has a better logistics service in the world than Amazon?
Yep.
Nobody. You talk to it also strikes me, you can talk to any 3PL on the planet. I don't care. Pick a name. All of them will openly admit Amazon is way better than us. Very openly.
Yeah.
That sounds like an asset to me. How can we leverage that? And by the way, we tried this thing called Amazon Pay, and it didn't seem like that successful.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what the number is. Let's call it 1 to 3% penetration.
Yeah.
Certainly not more successful than PayPal.
Yep.
But they've been at it longer, and so I think they're trying to see if they can jam a few things together, and participate in this growth off Amazon that seems to be happening, and not miss out on this upside. So that's, to me, that's the basics of it. Yeah.
Totally makes sense, and I think I do think that I think they do need to work out a bunch of product kinks around it. Our friends are, agency partners trying to help them ramp up. So we'll see how this plays out.
Exactly.
Especially in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, where they are, I think they're an alpha.
Yeah,
and so not a lot of people know what they're doing. Not a lot of people know what the results are right now.
Yeah.
And so it's a work in progress.
Makes sense.
And I think Amazon, I think that's probably what the world needs to know right now. And there are people that are experimenting with it, and to see what the results are. I think Amazon's pitch is, if you have the best logistics at the lowest, at free costs with free returns, you're going to greatly improve your conversion rate. And that's the pitch right now. And I think they're trying to prove that at scale. That's what they're trying to do right now.
Prove that at scale, convince people that it's okay to do.
Right, exactly.
So there's a lot happening.
We didn't talk about the whole trust issue right there, right?
That's right. So there's that, and then there's also tie-in with advertising, because they aren't just saying, hey, put a badge, but we'll help you drive a bunch of traffic to you. In theory, incredibly compelling. So we'll see how the trust part plays out and the execution plays out. So Rick, we are in 2023. One of the trends I have noticed all through 2021, and it's really started in 2021. And if you take Amazon, for example, they are democratizing and sharing an incredible amount of information. Walmart is doing a little bit of that. I think other marketplaces are going that direction. Amazon Marketing Cloud, we hear a lot about it. It's information at a grain that has never not been available before. And it's a data clean room. And it also allows retailers and brands to upload their own first-party data and build really targeted audiences. And Amazon Marketing Cloud is one of many examples where Amazon is sharing more and more data. Would love your take on what the implication of that is for brands in 2023.
Yeah, I think a couple of things about this. First of all, I think the big global brands are able to leverage this data. Most brands are not able to on their own anyway. So I think the reality is brands are going to see a benefit for these. I would say the rest of if you're not at the peak of the pyramid in terms of technological capabilities, if you're sort of everyone else, you're having to rely on essentially agencies and technology providers to give you a view into what this data means. And so to me, that's the big lesson for me with Amazon, is that they're trying to find essentially where the dollars being allocated and spent, and not trying to sell that on a brand by brand level. They're going to the agencies, they're going, to these service providers and opening up their kimono with the, I think, correct value proposition that says, who has better purchase intent shoppers than Amazon? Who has more traffic than us? Who has more data than us? And the more we open, the more we're going to win. I think it's only good news for Amazon from that front.
Yeah, and I think that it does certainly put a pressure on brands and agencies and everybody to kind of upskill and actually leverage these assets that are being made accessible. Certainly an opportunity for players like us.
Right. Yeah, I think the challenge for brands is, if you ask the average brand owner or marketer, do you need more data and reports? The answer will never be yes. They don't have enough time in the day to finish their email, much less to analyze how their business is going. So I think that's the flip side of this problem. And I think why raising the level on its own isn't good enough. It has to be easily digestible. It has to be packaged in a way, I think, by third parties and technology solutions, whether they're developed internally or externally, so that it becomes easier to take action on it, either automatically or otherwise.
Great point. And talking about brands, if I'm a brand listening to this conversation, right, Rick, and I've got big growth plans for 2023, thoughts on like key do's and don'ts in terms of executing that plan?
Wow. I think so. If we're talking about data for a second, I would say establishing one of the first things that I think is necessary for most brands to execute any kind of data transformation strategy is to have a data center of excellence, period. Most brands that are trying to do this, they have one person in the sales department that's helping support the sales team. They have one person in the marketing department that's helping support the marketing team. They have one person and the finance, supporting the finance team, who obviously needs those are usually the three concentrations. And then you have the IT team, who is tasked with supporting, let's say, Power BI and Microsoft Data Lake, for instance.
Yep.
And they don't really know anything necessarily about what the data does, and they're happy as long as it sort of stays running.
Yeah.
And so between this sort of collection of people, you really have no one who wakes up every day and thinks about a few things. Number one is, how do we find more data sources to add to our data lake, which will then become fuel for future reports and business improvements? So more data sources. Second is, how do we assess the quality of the data we already have every single day? And I think most people haven't even asked that question, much less answered it.
Yeah. Especially when these data sets are coming from the external world, and the pressure on data quality is a whole lot higher when that's happening.
Right. And I think the final thing, advice I would give to brands is you have this huge divide, and I think it gets back to this data excellence team, between individuals that are running the business and individuals that understand data. And there's a whole class of translators, whether they're called data analysts or product managers. Those are usually, two of the more common names, that are able to, they understand the power of data and they know enough about the business to be dangerous, but they don't know enough to really run a marketing department. And then on the other hand, you have marketing leadership who understands very well what the customer wants, segmentation, trends, attribution, where they want to allocate their money, but they don't know anything about the company's data assets and how to ask for the data they need in a smart way and to really integrate that in the best way in their workflow. So that usually takes some kind of product management or data analyst resources that is able to listen to the needs of the business, understand, okay, we have, I'm just going to use a strange, like an example. We have 20 data points. Half of them are riddled with errors. Half are good. We need another 30 data points. Where can we get this data from? Maybe there are source systems that haven't been integrated with the data lake, either internally or externally. So there's a lot of connective tissue internally in these particularly larger brands that it's very hard to run those. There are brands that have done a fantastic job at this, but I think they're more often than not, you see understaffing and these sorts of areas.
So just to summarize those last points, right? So comprehensiveness of data, focus on data quality. And I mean, I don't know what the right term is, but you need these bridgers between the data world and the business world. Mm-hmm. And in the realm of retail media, there is another universe that is kind of disconnected, which is the teams that manage media from the teams that run ops and from the teams that manage data. And how these three come together potentially will drive or influence the efficiency of any brand, that is, trying to drive growth, especially on these marketplaces.
Yeah, and look, the good thing about mid-market companies and smaller companies is that you don't need to hire all these people. True. You do if you're a big brand. Yeah. If you're a smaller brand, then a lot of that work moves to service providers. And so if you have a good dashboard provider and a good PPC campaign manager, like whatever, you like go anywhere on the data in the marketing stack. If it's not easy for someone who's not an expert, who's early in the career of digital marketing to use, then they're not going to use it. Yep. And some other company is going to win. And so it's the technology provider's job to provide the product managers and the data translators and listen to their customers to build in something easy to use.
Yeah. Rick, perhaps I'll end this conversation with asking you a question, but it's time for predictions in 2023. So I would be curious to see what is your take on, what would your predictions be, noteworthy predictions, for the year?
Yeah, I think Amazon is going to keep gaining share because they have the selection and the inventory, I would say, relative to the average D2C brand, that's grown up over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think there are two things that have happened to direct to consumer in the past few years, one after the other, and it's almost like a 1-2 punch in some respects. The first punch was Apple and others squeezing the cost of customer acquisition due to targeting and other challenges. And everyone's seen that played out over the past 18 months. But the second thing that's happening since interest rates have started going up is the cost of capital is getting higher. And what that means for the average direct-to-consumer brand or organization or even software provider, that means raising money is more difficult, or financing your inventory is more expensive. And so the things that you were able to do in 2 years ago at the height of the pandemic are harder now and harder to justify. And so I think that is going to shake out some marginally profitable brands, that were maybe just breaking even or just squeaking by, or it will force them to really tighten their belts as they kind of move forward. So I think that's another thing that I kind of look at. And usually I always start with a lot of my consulting practice. I work with private equity and venture capital because that's where the money starts, right? And then it sort of trickles down to or gets doled out to the rest of the economy. And we're all kind of affected by what's happening in the capital markets to some extent. But I love following the other side too, which is like, what are the operators thinking? And I think more advertising dollars will continue to flow to Amazon. I think Google's going to be, just fine. Facebook is going to be relatively fine, as long as Mark Zuckerberg doesn't starve off Facebook of or Meta of investment instead of developing VR. Yeah, so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. I mean, we see a lot of early stage stuff that is super interesting, like Chat GPT and these things, but these are, I would say, going to generate a lot of interest in 2023. But I think the commercialization, much like the internet, despite the fact that you can find a lot of Chat GPT apps on the App Store today, none of them are actually legal because you can't commercialize the technology yet. But 2024, 2025, it will be a different story.
Awesome. Well, Rick, this has been a fantastic conversation. I just don't think we'll have enough time to talk about all the topics you can talk about. In fact, even this recording itself has stretched a couple of sessions. But sincerely appreciate you taking the time coming onto our podcast, and wish you the very best in 2023. Should be an exciting year.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Serena. I appreciate you having me on.